January 17, 1946. The winter light filters weakly through the tall windows of a former Wehrmacht barracks in Nuremberg, now converted into an interrogation facility. The room smells of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke. Across a scarred wooden table sits a man in his mid-40s, his gray uniform replaced by civilian clothing that hangs loosely on his diminished frame. His name is recorded in the Allied documents as Hans Müller, formerly Oberscharführer of the SS, guard commander at a small labor camp in the forests of eastern Germany. His hands rest flat on the table, motionless, as though weighted by invisible chains. When he speaks, his voice carries no defiance, no justification, only a hollow exhaustion that comes from carrying unspeakable knowledge for too long. "We made prisoners stand in wooden boxes for days," he says, the words emerging like stones dropped into still water. "Some of them died standing up." The war has been over for 8 months. Across the shattered landscape of Europe, the full magnitude of Nazi atrocity is emerging from the fog of rumor into the harsh illumination of documented fact. The concentration camp system, once dismissed by some as Allied propaganda, now stands exposed in all its systematic horror. But within this vast architecture of cruelty existed thousands of smaller camps, sub-camps, and detention facilities, places whose names would never achieve the terrible immortality of Auschwitz or Dachau, yet where suffering occurred with equal methodical precision. These smaller installations were scattered throughout the Reich and occupied territories, often attached to factories, mines, or construction projects. Guards at these facilities were not always the ideological zealots of the SS elite. Many were older men, deemed unfit for frontline service, or younger soldiers recovering from wounds sustained in combat. They arrived at their posts expecting tedious duty, perhaps some administrative work, certainly nothing that would mark their souls forever. What they found instead was a system that transformed ordinary men into administrators of daily torment. Hans Müller had been a postal clerk in Munich before the war. His military service began in 1940, fighting in France, where he sustained a leg injury that left him with a permanent limp. By 1943, he was assigned to camp duty, a position he initially welcomed as safer than the Eastern Front, where so many of his comrades had vanished into the Russian winter. He expected to oversee work details, maintain order, perhaps prevent escapes. What he did not expect was the systematic dehumanization that defined every aspect of camp operations. The wooden boxes he mentions in his confession were called Stehbunker in camp terminology, standing cells. Constructed from rough timber, these enclosures measured approximately 3 feet by 3 feet at the base and 7 feet in height. A human being could fit inside only by standing perfectly upright. There was no room to sit, no space to turn, no possibility of rest. Prisoners were sealed inside these boxes for punishment, sometimes for alleged infractions as minor as working too slowly or maintaining eye contact with a guard, sometimes for no documented reason at all. The practice was not unique to Müller's camp. Similar punishment cells existed throughout the concentration camp system, variations on a theme of psychological and physical torture designed to break the human spirit without the inefficiency of immediate execution. At Auschwitz, the Stehbunker were located in Block 11, the camp prison, where 4 prisoners might be crammed into a space designed for one, forced to stand through the night before being marched to labor details the next morning. At Dachau, standing cells were constructed in the bunker building, where prisoners stood in darkness, sometimes for weeks, their legs swelling to grotesque proportions, their minds fragmenting under the sustained assault of sensory deprivation and physical agony. The Nazis had industrialized not only murder, but also the gradations of suffering that preceded it. They had created a taxonomy of torment, each method calibrated to achieve specific effects on the human organism. Miller describes arriving at his first posting with a sense of nervous anticipation. He had been told he would be overseeing Jewish laborers and political prisoners at a facility attached to an armaments factory. The propaganda he had absorbed throughout the 1930s had prepared him to view these prisoners as dangerous elements, threats to German security who nonetheless could be made useful through labor. He expected defiance, perhaps even organized resistance that would need to be suppressed. What he encountered instead were hollow-eyed men and women who moved with the mechanical slowness of the perpetually starving, whose bodies were already transforming into the skeletal forms that would later shock Allied liberators. There was no defiance because there was barely life. The prisoners were not dangerous revolutionaries, but human beings systematically reduced to biological functions, their existence compressed to the narrow channel between survival and death. The standing boxes became part of the camp's routine architecture of control. Miller recalls how casually the practice was introduced during his orientation. A senior guard, a man named Dietrich, who had been transferred from Sachsenhausen, explained the punishment system as though describing maintenance procedures for machinery. For minor infractions, reduced rations. For repeated violations, the Stehbunker. For attempted escape or sabotage, hanging. The wooden boxes stood in a row behind the administration building, their crude construction at odds with the efficient brutality of their purpose. They were weathered gray, the planks warped from rain and snow, dark stains marking the wood where bodily fluids had seeped through the cracks. Miller admits he felt revulsion the first time he witnessed a prisoner being sealed inside. The man was Polish, arrested for resistance activities, though by the time Miller encountered him, he seemed incapable of resisting anything. 2 guards forced him into the box, his body rigid with terror, and nailed the door shut. The prisoner's breathing was audible through the gaps in the planks, rapid panicked inhalations that gradually slowed as hours became days. Yet Muller did not protest. He did not report the practice to any higher authority, though he knew instinctively that what he was witnessing transcended any legitimate military discipline. Instead, he participated. Within weeks, he was ordering prisoners into the boxes himself, signing the punishment rosters, calculating the days of confinement based on camp regulations that existed nowhere in written form but were understood perfectly by every guard. He tells his interrogators that he convinced himself he was following orders, that the system was larger than any individual decision, that his refusal would have accomplished nothing except his own punishment or transfer to the Eastern Front. These justifications sound hollow even as he speaks them, his voice trailing off into silence before resuming. The truth he circles around, never quite articulating but clearly understanding, is that the system could only function because thousands of ordinary men like him made the daily choice to participate rather than resist. The physical effects of confinement in the standing boxes were predictable and grotesque. Human legs are not designed to bear weight continuously without respite. After 12 hours, swelling begins. After 24 hours, the pain becomes excruciating as blood pools in the lower extremities and circulation fails. After 48 hours, the body enters crisis. Prisoners emerged from days in the Stehbunker, unable to walk, their legs balloon-like and discolored, their feet so swollen they split their wooden camp shoes. Some suffered permanent nerve damage. Others developed infections from standing in their own waste. The wooden floor of the box slick with urine and feces. The psychological damage was equally severe and less visible. Miller describes men who emerged from the boxes unable to speak coherently, their eyes unfocused, their minds temporarily shattered by the sustained torture. Some never fully recovered, moving through the remaining weeks or months of their lives, in a state of dissociated silence before succumbing to disease, starvation, or execution. The standing boxes served no practical purpose related to camp security or productivity. Prisoners subjected to this punishment were often unable to work for days or weeks afterward, representing a net loss in the labor output that supposedly justified the camp's existence. The practice existed purely as an expression of power, a demonstration that the camp authorities possessed absolute control over the prisoners' bodies and could inflict suffering simply because they chose to. It was cruelty as communication, a message encoded in physical agony that said, "You are not human, you possess no rights. Your existence continues only at our discretion and can be made unbearable at our whim." This was the essence of the concentration camp system, not merely to exploit labor or execute enemies, but to establish a realm where the normal rules of human society were suspended, where guards could exercise godlike power over life, death, and everything between. Miller's transformation from reluctant observer to active participant followed a pattern documented in countless testimonies from camp personnel. The initial shock and revulsion gradually dulled through repeated exposure. The propaganda narrative that portrayed prisoners as subhuman enemies provided a convenient psychological framework for rationalizing cruelty. The camp's social structure created pressure to conform. Guards who expressed sympathy for prisoners were viewed as weak, potentially disloyal, and were often transferred or subjected to informal punishment by their peers. Most fundamentally, the daily immersion in an environment where human suffering was routine recalibrated moral perception. Acts that would have been unthinkable in civilian life became normal within the camp's boundaries. The wooden boxes were simply part of the landscape, like the barbed wire and guard towers, mundane infrastructure of an extraordinary system. He recalls one prisoner in particular, a French professor arrested for hiding Jewish children. The man spoke German fluently and had initially tried to communicate with the guards, explaining that there had been a mistake, that he was merely an educator with no political affiliations. Miller ordered him into a standing box for 3 days after he was caught trying to save a portion of his bread ration. When the prisoner emerged, he no longer spoke. His legs had swollen so severely that the camp doctor, a former veterinarian who dispensed aspirin and performed amputations with equal indifference, recommended he be sent to the infirmary. Instead, he was returned to the labor detail. He died 2 weeks later, collapsing during the morning roll call and never regaining consciousness. His body was added to the pile awaiting cremation, one more unit in the industrial processing of death. Miller signed the death certificate, attributing the cause to heart failure, which was technically accurate if one ignored the chain of causation leading to that final cardiac arrest. The symbolic weight of the standing boxes extended beyond their immediate function as instruments of torture. They represented the Nazi system's fundamental perversion of order and discipline. Military justice systems, even harsh ones, traditionally maintained some relationship between offense and punishment, some theoretical framework of rules that applied equally to all subjects. The concentration camps operated under no such constraints. Punishment was arbitrary, excessive, and designed not to correct behavior, but to terrorize. The wooden boxes stood as physical manifestations of this perverted order, structures that looked almost ordinary, that could be mistaken from a distance for storage sheds or equipment lockers, but which contained within their rough planks a distillation of systematic inhumanity. They were the banality of evil made literal, torture rendered mundane through repetition and routine. As the war turned against Germany, conditions in the camps deteriorated further. Food shipments became irregular, medical supplies vanished entirely, and the camps swelled with prisoners evacuated from facilities in the east as Soviet forces advanced. The standing boxes continued to be used, even as the camp descended into chaos. Miller describes the final months before liberation as a descent into hell, though he struggles to articulate what made those last weeks worse than the preceding years of methodical atrocity. Perhaps it was the collapse of even the pretense of order, the guards' growing awareness that they would be held accountable for their actions, the desperate attempts to destroy evidence even as new atrocities continued. In April 1945, as American forces approached, orders came to evacuate the camp. Most prisoners were forced on death marches toward the interior of Germany. Those too weak to walk were shot. The wooden boxes were set on fire, part of a hasty attempt to destroy evidence of what had occurred there. Miller surrendered to American troops without resistance. He was processed as a prisoner of war and held for months before his role as a camp guard was discovered. His interrogation is part of a massive effort to document Nazi crimes, to create an evidentiary record that will make denial impossible. The Allied investigators have interviewed thousands of guards, administrators, and functionaries of the concentration camp system. A pattern emerges from these testimonies: ordinary men committing extraordinary crimes, each insisting they were following orders, each describing their participation with a mixture of defensiveness and stunned incomprehension at what they had become. Miller's confession stands out for its detail and his apparent willingness to confront, at least partially, his own moral collapse. He does not claim he was forced to participate in the torture of prisoners. He does not insist he was simply following orders, though he mentions orders frequently. What comes through in his testimony is a man grappling with the knowledge that he had choices, however constrained, and that he consistently chose cruelty over mercy, participation over resistance, conformity over moral courage. The standing boxes exist now only in testimony and in a few photographs taken by Allied investigators at liberated camps. The physical structures have been destroyed, burned by retreating Germans, or dismantled by liberators who could hardly believe such devices had been real. But their symbolic presence persists in the historical record as evidence of how systems of oppression function through the accumulated decisions of ordinary individuals. The camps could not have operated without the Hans Millers of the Nazi state, men who were not ideological fanatics but who nonetheless participated daily in mechanized cruelty. They signed the orders, nailed shut the doors, recorded the deaths, and went home to their quarters each evening to eat their meals and write letters to family members who knew nothing of what their sons and husbands were doing in the forests of the East. The liberation of the camps forced a reckoning with knowledge that many had suspected, but few had fully confronted. The systematic nature of Nazi genocide, the industrial scale of the murder, and the countless smaller cruelties that accompanied the killing process all emerged into documented reality. The standing boxes represent a particular category of atrocity, torture that served no strategic or economic purpose, suffering inflicted simply because the system permitted it and men chose to participate. They stand as evidence that the Holocaust was not merely the work of a handful of ideological extremists, but required the daily collaboration of thousands of ordinary people who made the choice to inflict or ignore suffering rather than resist a system they knew to be evil. Miller's interrogation continues for hours, the stenographer recording his words while Allied officers probe for details about camp operations, command structures, and the fate of specific prisoners. His testimony will become part of the massive documentary record assembled for the Nuremberg trials and subsequent prosecutions. He will eventually be tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison, though his sentence will be far shorter than the suffering he helped administer. The justice system, even as it struggles to hold perpetrators accountable, cannot fully calibrate punishment to match the magnitude of these crimes. Numbers become inadequate. How do you quantify the suffering of a man forced to stand in a wooden box for 3 days until his mind broke? How do you multiply that agony by thousands of prisoners across hundreds of camps to arrive at any meaningful accounting? In the decades that follow, the wooden standing boxes will be mentioned in histories and memoirs of the concentration camp system. One detail among countless others in the vast catalogue of Nazi atrocity, they will appear in museum exhibits attempting to help visitors comprehend the daily reality of camp life. Survivors will describe them in oral histories, their voices still carrying the weight of that experience decades later, and historians will analyze them as evidence of how totalitarian systems normalize cruelty, transforming torture from aberration to routine through bureaucratic process and social pressure to conform. The boxes themselves have vanished, but what they represented, the reduction of human beings to objects of absolute power, suffering inflicted as a demonstration of control, the participation of ordinary people in extraordinary evil, remains as a warning carved into history. The winter light in the interrogation room shifts as afternoon moves toward evening. Miller has been speaking for hours, his voice growing hoarse, his story emerging in fragments that the investigators will later assemble into coherent narrative. He will return to his cell knowing that he has confessed to crimes that most of humanity would consider unforgivable. He will live the remainder of his life carrying the knowledge of what he did, the memory of men and women he tortured, the faces of those who died because he chose obedience to an evil system over resistance. His confession changes nothing for the dead. It cannot restore the Polish resistance fighter, or the French professor, or the countless others who stood in wooden boxes until their bodies failed and their spirits broke. But it adds to the historical record one more piece of evidence in the documentation of how easily ordinary human beings can be transformed into instruments of cruelty when systems of power demand it and individual moral courage fails. The standing boxes endure in memory as a symbol of a particular truth about human nature and political systems, that evil requires not only ideological commitment but also routine participation, that atrocity happens through the accumulated small choices of thousands of individuals, and that the preservation of human dignity depends on the willingness of ordinary people to resist even when resistance carries terrible costs. They remind us that freedom is not merely the absence of constraint, but the presence of moral courage, that democracy survives not through systems alone, but through the daily decisions of citizens to uphold human dignity, even when power structures permit its violation. In their crude simplicity, those wooden boxes contained a profound lesson about what happens when power is unchecked, when human beings are stripped of legal protection, and when ordinary people choose compliance over conscience. The confession of a guard who operated them adds one more voice to the chorus of historical witness, ensuring that what happened in those forests and camps will not be forgotten, will not be denied, and will stand as permanent warning of what humanity is capable of when it abandons its commitment to the fundamental dignity of every human life.